Hey, Steve Saretsky here. I'm with NDP's David Eby, who is the leading housing critic. Obviously a pretty big election coming up, so thanks for obviously taking this time.
Yeah, my pleasure, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I want to get to, obviously, I guess, first topic is sort of what's your take on the current housing market? You know, since the foreign buyers tax, things sort of cooled off. It seemed like maybe it was working, and obviously as 2017 rolled over, things started to pick back up again. Condos are setting new highs. I think really the crunch for affordability or for housing is basically just as great as it was in 2016. So what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the people who I talk to in my community, nothing has changed. The housing is still as unaffordable as it was. Rental housing is still as hard to find as it ever was. So they have no prospect of buying anything. They have a really difficult time finding anything to rent. And there's no change from the government, no substantive change that's going to make any difference for anybody in the community that I talk to. Even this second mortgage program where they'll lend you the down payment, most people are looking at that and saying it makes no sense for them. Mm-hmm. So as far as I can tell, the big achievement of the foreign buyers tax is it gives the government something to talk about when people say the housing market's out of control. But the reality for most people, most families, is it still doesn't make any sense for them.
Yeah, exactly. So are you sort of, I mean, we're going to dive into this, but are you in favor of the foreign buyers tax? Like, I know your initial reaction when it first came out, you were, not very optimistic about it. You didn't think it was the best way of implementing it, but as it's unfolded, and here we are, 8-9 months after it, what's your take on it? Like, where do you stand right now?
The big problem with the foreign buyer tax, I think, as a lot of people saw, and myself included, as trying to lock the barn door after the horses had left about a year and a half ago. And the real estate market, I mean, here in Vancouver, detached house up $600,000 in just a couple of years. To impose a tax on everyone who buys after a certain date, it's kind of like, well, what impact is that going to have? And only 15%, given the fact that the currency had depreciated by more than that amount. Mm-hmm. I was actually shocked that it had the impact that it did have, that it had any impact at all on the housing market, because it seemed like such a limited step. What the proposal that we continue to support is the proposal out of UBC, the Housing Affordability Fund proposal, where you give an extra property tax to people who don't pay their income tax in British Columbia or buying property in Metro Vancouver. And the idea is quite simple, is you make it a less attractive investment. You make housing a less attractive investment for people who don't live, work, and pay taxes here.
Yeah, exactly. So that would basically stimulate the demand side of things. With that being said, is it NDP's platform to actually keep in? Like, what's your plan? So obviously that you're lobbying for the 2% on, but then would you also keep the 15% foreign buyers tax in? Would that still stay put?
Yeah, absolutely. We would keep the foreign buyer tax. We might refine it just to make sure that the critical piece for me is that nobody should pay that tax who's living, working, and paying taxes in the areas where the tax applies. We would talk with communities if they wanted to expand it to their area. I know there's some talk in Victoria, South Vancouver Island, about expanding the tax. Certainly in agricultural land is an area where we could look at expanding the tax. But in terms of the foreign buyer tax, there's no plan to get rid of it, and in fact, possibly to expand it to different geographic areas or different types of land.
Yeah, so you wouldn't necessarily, like, day one, as soon as you get in, like, we're going to implement this in Victoria. Is that something that you guys have to do maybe like a little bit more homework on and that sort of thing? Like, because I know there's obviously some people from Victoria that watch this video and they've been asking about a foreign buyers tax. They've been lobbying for it. So where do you see that happening?
I think the key is, I mean, for me, for Metro Vancouver, it was really clear there was an overwhelming demand for that in Metro Vancouver, and that there was support for it from the community. Obviously, if there's some possibility it's going to have an impact on prices or the escalation in prices in the area, you want to make sure that people are on side with that. When you look at a community like Whistler that's dependent on a lot of tourism, maybe people buying condos who are from all over the world, it would be less attractive and they would be less interested in having a foreign buyer tax. And so you want to make sure that you're on side with the community before you take an action like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, it's interesting to see, like, governments obviously come in and try to cool the housing market and whatnot. I mean, first off, what sort of took our current government so long to, jump in? Because basically, if you look at it, not only in Vancouver, but basically across the lower mainland, for the most part, prices are up about 50% over the last 2 years. So, clearly when incomes are relatively flat, and you have house price growth of 50%, it creates some serious issues. So what took so long? Because the 15% tax didn't come in until, was it June or July of 2016? So
yeah, well, I think one of the things that was really instructive for me was to look at what happened in Ontario. So after BC brought in the foreign buyer tax, Ontario, particularly Toronto, started seeing a very significant appreciation in their real estate market, 30% in a single year. And the government didn't wait. They said, we're going to put in the foreign buyer tax, we're going to restrict the flipping of pre-sale condos, and they acted right away. And I think that in acting right away, you send a strong message that this is not going to be a market that will be used for this absentee investment speculation that's taking place. And that's not what happened in BC. And the reasons for that are varied. I think that the government was very captured by their donors, big political donors, Bob Rennie, the Condo King, as a chief fundraiser, bringing in all his developer friends, who also provided not just money, but also advice to the government that, oh, it's only 3% of the market, don't worry about it. And then when they finally started collecting even basic statistics, they saw it was 20% of the market in some cities. And
yeah, I think Richmond was up about 25%.
Yeah, and Burnaby was around 20%, Vancouver was around 20%. So a huge portion of what was driving the market. And that was just people holding international passports. That's not just international money.
Yeah, so I think that's sort of one of the big things too, right? So people can say, okay, well, yes, if you total up all of Metro Vancouver, it's something around 10%. I think that's what the numbers were saying. But that really doesn't capture the actual foreign money that's coming in, because a lot of them, let's call it what it is they have their Canadian passports, they have their permanent residency or whatnot. So you're able to basically avoid that. So I mean, like, how much of an impact does that play, right?
Yeah, a lot of these investors might be domestic, they might be international. It's not, to me, it's not what passport you hold or what your background is. What it is what you're doing in the market. And if you are buying property here and you're not paying taxes here, you're bringing in money from wherever you're earning it without paying taxes on it. You're competing with local people who are paying British Columbia and federal taxes. They can't compete. Yeah. And it's totally unfair. And so that is the activity that I think we should be focused on, and that is what we should be trying to address. And that's why this proposal out of UBC that we support, that more than 40 economists support, is tied to whether or not you're paying income tax in Metro Vancouver. I think it's a really important factor to identify as kind of a proxy for, are you participating in our community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's always two sides to the debate. Obviously there's the demand side, and then there's the supply side. So people can argue back and forth about what's actually causing house prices. I mean, first off, I sort of want to get your opinion. What do you feel are sort of the main factors, the biggest factors that stick out to you in terms of what's really caused this? Again, like I said, 50% in the last 2 years. What's your take on that?
I think it's absolutely right for people who point at supply and say supply is an issue, and people who point at demand and say there's toxic demand out there that's driving this. Both things are driving it. The problem with the supply side argument is that the people who make it often leave a really critical word out of the supply, which is affordable housing supply. I mean, Vancouver's never had more housing starts. An historic high in housing starts. We've never built more housing in Vancouver than we're building right now. It's like, what kind of housing are we building? If you build a 500 square foot studio apartment with executive chef and valet parking, and it's $750,000 or $800,000, how does that help any family in Metro Vancouver? It doesn't. It is supply. It's a new unit, no question, but it's catering to an absentee investor market. It is not catering to local people. And so we need to be increasing our affordable housing supply. We can use public land to increase our affordable housing supply. We can use government subsidy to encourage developers to build affordable housing supply. We can use all kinds of different models, everything from land trust to co-ops to leasehold to rent to own. There are models from all over the world that we can be using to increase affordable housing supply. But the big issue is government, does the provincial government believe they have a role to play in the market in ensuring that affordable housing supply? So I agree with the supply people. We need more supply, but not just like more supply generally, more affordable housing supply for people who live, work, and pay taxes in Metro.
Absolutely. So do you think government subsidy would be maybe one of the better things to do? Because what I get is with this counter argument, speaking with developers and whatnot, is not only in Vancouver but in Toronto, the biggest issue is that obviously you're paying a premium for the land, and these guys ultimately are running a business, and they're trying to basically profit as much as they can. And so what happens is they end up building all this luxury product that really doesn't fit any locals. It's actually most of it, like there's an article in the Globe and Mail that came out that talks about pre-sale assignment flipping. So basically a lot of this is actually sold offshore and then it eventually gets flipped or an assignment to a local at a higher cost. So, you know, how do we sort of combat that and figure that out? Because they're trying to make their profits, they're pushing for more density, but again, a lot of this new supply that's coming on isn't actually helping or isn't targeted for locals.
Yep. I have a really hard time blaming these speculators, blaming the investors, blaming the developers for doing what, of course, they're going to do, which is to seek the highest profit they can to make as much money as they can from doing the project. And they might put community amenities in, and they might make a donation to the local hospital. They might be really good people. But the system that we've set up is a broken system that encourages them to do this and doesn't take into consideration the impact on the local community. And so when we sell off the Oak Ridge Transit Barns land for $500 million, it's like logging old growth forests. It's a huge parcel of land that could have been used to build an amazing mixed income community that would have dividends for generations into the future, of a sustainable community of people of all income backgrounds. Instead, we sell it off to the highest bidder, and that developer has to recover the cost of that land from the development site.
Totally.
And so that means that even before a single housing unit is put on the site, it's already unaffordable to the vast majority of people in Metro Vancouver. And we have to be smarter about how we're using our land, how we're using our public assets like land, and how we're encouraging developers to do the right thing. The West End, if we could look out the front window of this office, right across we'd see all these towers in the West End, rental housing built through a federal government subsidy that encouraged the construction of purpose-built rental housing called the MERB program.
Yeah.
That's how the West End was built. We wouldn't have that if the federal government hadn't been involved in the housing market. So we need government to believe again that they have a role to play in this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to quickly touch on one more thing. I mean, obviously, with these pre-sale condos and stuff, with the assignments taking place, and that's obviously a speculative move, maybe it's something that governments have sort of talked about can cause prices to go up. Does the NDP foresee a speculation tax or some sort of banning of pre-sale condo assignments? Or because I know as it stands right now, the 15% foreign buyers tax does not apply till pre-sale condos because they're not registered in land titles until they actually complete, right?
Yeah.
So what's your guys' stance on that? What's your stance on it?
We called the fact that the foreign buyer tax didn't apply to pre-sale condos, we called it the Rennie exemption, because Bob Rennie, obviously the king of pre-sale condos and the major fundraiser for the Premier. We will end this practice of the flipping of pre-sale condos, and the mechanism that we use to end it is an open question, whether we would use a tax, a speculator's tax, whether we would force people to register the assignment. The value that we want to protect is that if someone buys a pre-sale condo and they get sick or they lose their job or there's something catastrophic happens, that they're able to assign it. They're not forced into bankruptcy because of something that happened to them. And the activity that we want to prevent is people buying and selling these things like concert tickets out front of GM Place, trying to make the maximum return. I think we can do it. Ontario has put a mechanism in place. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out. I'm not sure that the shadow flipping regulation that the Premier brought in has had an effect on this kind of activity. So we want to make sure it works at stopping what we want to stop, and we want to make sure it still enables those people who are caught in a difficult situation that they're able to sell a pre-sale condo if they need to.
Okay. Yeah, I know, absolutely. So obviously appreciate obviously your time, but I wanted to jump into some of the questions.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I saw you were asking on Twitter.
Yeah, some of the guys that are asking. So I'm going to dive into those. We might have touched on a little bit of them already, but I'll give you a chance to sort of go into it in further detail here.
Okay, great.
Okay, so Aaron asked, I'd like to hear about an NDP government, how they treat existing home partnership programs. So that's obviously, for anyone that doesn't know what that is, that's the first-time home buyers subsidy for people that can't afford their down payment. The government obviously provides part of the down payment. So what's the NDP's take on that?
So anyone who's in that program right now, the program will continue. We'll do a full review of the program. This is a $750 million program of which there's been a very limited uptake. If the uptake of this program continues at the current rate, the government won't hit their target for people who apply for it until 40 years from now. So not many people are taking advantage of it because it's not working for them. So we want to make sure that a program that's in place actually has the intended result, that it gets more people into housing that they can own that's affordable for them. Okay. And so we're going to do a review of that program to make sure it's doing that. I don't think it's doing that, but we'll make sure. And anyone who's in the program, it will continue. They don't need to worry about that. But anyone who's looking at it and going, this doesn't really fit my needs. We want to give them hope that a better program that actually does fit their needs, that can help get them into affordable housing, is on the horizon with the BC NDP government.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to touch on that because I've obviously had that conversation with some of my clients who are first-time buyers, mortgage brokers, etc. And I guess the issue from my side is ultimately I would say it's actually helped potentially stimulate more demand in the market, which actually has created housing condos to become actually more unaffordable because you actually added a little bit more demand. So as though not as many people have actually been using the program, I think there's had 300 or 400 people since the program came out that have actually gone ahead and been approved. But I just look at that, even if you add 300 or 400 onto a market where you're still getting 4 or 5 offers on every single condo, you're just adding basically one more offer onto that. And so I just see that as potential where, from an economic standpoint, it might not make sense, but at the same time, yes, you obviously want to help people get into the market. So it's kind of like, where do you draw that line?
Yes. I mean, I think when you say that, it just identifies again what the real issue is, which is a lack of affordable housing supply. I mean, if we had more affordable housing supply, then you could address a lot of this issue of the multiple offer situations and so on, and we just don't have that happening.
Yeah, and you've talked about Singapore being sort of one of the world-class, I guess, examples. Can you sort of, for people that don't know Singapore's housing, can you sort of touch on what they're doing over there?
Yeah, I mean, exactly the programs as they're implemented in Singapore might not be a great fit for British Columbia, but here's a government that said, it is our priority to make sure that Singaporeans are able to own their own home. And they put programs in place to make that possible. Now they have over 90% home ownership in Singapore. Now, Singapore is a tiny place. It's got a huge population, and yet they've been able to achieve almost 90% home ownership. And they did this by prioritizing the ability of locals to be able to buy into the market. So if Singapore can do it, it makes Metro Vancouver's problems look really simple by comparison, because Metro Vancouver is a much larger area with a much smaller population. If Singapore can do it, certainly we can do it.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely a good example. Okay, so next question here is from our @YVR housing analyst, and they said, what should provincial regulators do to ensure that lawyers, banks, and others are accountable to report suspicious financial transactions? So I guess, there's sort of that issue with, even from a realtor standpoint, if you sort of get a little bit, of a dicey feeling, at the same time that you're a client and you owe a fiduciary duty to look out for their best interests, it's a system that's not necessarily set up to, report them, right? So that's let's be honest. How many realtors have training to identify money laundering, suspicious transactions? Let's say there's a guy with a huge beard and a leather vest, and it says Hell's Angels on the back, and he walks into your office and he has a big bag of cash and he sets it down and says, I'd like to buy a condo. I mean, this is a suspicious transaction. So you fill out the FinTrack report and say suspicious transaction, and you send it off to FinTrack, you do your realtor's duty. What happens? As far as I can tell, nothing happens. Yeah. It goes into a warehouse, a data warehouse somewhere. Maybe FinTrack sends a fax to a local police detachment where they're overstretched, dealing with fentanyl and mental health and all the other problems that they're dealing with in the street. They are not pursuing that. As far as I can tell, there is little or no investigation of either financial crime, money laundering, or tax evasion happening in Metro Vancouver. So that's why we've committed. We're going to set up a task force, a group of auditors, provincial auditors, that will go and they will investigate tax evasion and money laundering in our housing market. It is appalling that Transparency International Canada could do an audit of the top 100 priced properties in Vancouver and find that half of them are owned by offshore trusts or shell companies, numbered companies, or so-called beneficial owners. These are people like students or homemakers who are not the actual owner. How did we get into this situation that our housing market is this way for people to conceal where the money is actually coming from? So we need to fix that, and that would be a priority of our government. Yeah, because I think Canada's, I can tell you from a realtor's perspective, it's like FinTrack almost seems more of like a formality than anything. And obviously Canada being highlighted globally as one of the easiest ways to launder money, particularly into real estate. I think that speaks for itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that British Columbia has deliberately, through willful blindness, facilitated an environment in the hopes of creating economic growth from it, where you can launder money.
Yeah.
And that's the only way to explain the inaction of the government on this file, because we know it's happening, we know it's a problem. Our international partners are telling us it's a problem, and yet still nothing.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, Raymond Wong asks, will you consider a speculation tax, seeing buyers who buy single-family homes sell after a short period, declare primary home to avoid tax, and then they buy again? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think what we really want to target is not someone who has to move because their job changes or because they are in a community and sometimes they have to move more frequently than they would have liked. What we really want to target is people who are using homes as an investment instead of as a place to live. The federal government has introduced new rules to limit the primary residence capital gains exemption to one per family, which should theoretically restrict people who are putting a house in the name of each of the children and the husband and the wife, and everybody's got a house and they're running a multiple flip and renovate kind of situation without having to pay any corporate taxes with that kind of business activity. Yeah. What we need is actually some enforcement around that. Someone's got to stand up to the federal government and say, we need Canada Revenue Agency to dedicate a lot more resources to make sure that the rules that you're putting in place are actually being followed.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of scrutiny on that, on CRA there, so I think it's definitely something that's needed. Okay, just a couple more questions. Andrew asks, is lowering real estate prices part of your mandate or objective, and if so, by how much in percentage terms, would you see prices coming in? What's your stance on that?
Yeah, we're in a really awful situation because of the government's decisions over the last couple of years, but actually over closer to the last decade. If prices go up, it's even worse of a problem for the sustainability of our economy in Metro Vancouver and for young people to be able to stay here. If prices go down dramatically, it's going to be devastating for our local economy. Real estate is the #1 driver of Metro Vancouver's economy.
Yeah.
And if prices stay the same, it remains unsustainable. So there's no good outcome here. I think that for most of us, when we look at it, we hope for a soft landing in housing prices, and in particular, that there's a significant increase in affordable housing. Now, when I look at Hong Kong, they have 50% non-market housing that it's government subsidized in some way for their workforce. And the 50% of market housing that they have is still wildly unaffordable, but at least people can afford to live and work in Hong Kong. It doesn't necessarily follow that if you massively increase affordable housing, including affordable housing to purchase, that the rest of the market falls apart.
Yeah.
So I think that the key for us is going to be to massively increase affordable housing and to crack down on the speculators who are buying property here but not paying taxes here. And my sincere hope is that people will be able to find affordable housing in Metro Vancouver if they live, work, and pay taxes here as a result of that.
Oh, great answer. Okay, so Richard asked, will you guys bring in rent control? And if you do, what will happen to the market if thousands of proposed new rental units are shelved because of it?
Yeah. We have rent control in BC. Rent control is the prime rate plus 2%. Yeah. And so it already exists. What we have, unfortunately, is abuse of the fixed term lease by a lot of landlords where they say, we'll rent you the place for a year and then you have to get out. And at the end of the year, maybe we'll rent you again, but it's a brand new lease starting at a brand new rent level. And so they're avoiding rent control. We're going to close that loophole. We're going to close the rent eviction loophole where a landlord pretends to do renovations or does very minor cosmetic renovations, kicks a tenant out because they're a low rent paying tenant protected by rent control, and brings in a new tenant that's not protected by rent control at a new rental rate. We're going to end that rent eviction practice by allowing tenants to return at the previous rent and the incentive for landlords to engage in that kind of conduct. But what we're not going to do is have rent control tied to a unit, which I think is what the question's about.
Yeah.
That like New York, this particular apartment is rent controlled and rent cannot go up in that unit. We're not going to do that. What we're going to do is a massive increase in the number of rental housing units available. We're going to do a huge build of student residence rooms on campus to get students out of the private rental market. We're going to give cities the tools they need to make sure that short-term rentals are regulated in the way that's most appropriate for that city. And we're going to make sure that cities have the rental housing that their community actually needs, which is a significant increase in what's called purpose-built rental, which is buildings which are rental housing units, and that's through rental-only zoning. We've got a comprehensive plan about how to build this rental housing that we need. The issue is a shortage of rental housing, and we need to build a lot of it.
Yeah, no, love it. I agree. Because I think Toronto actually brought their rent control in, so there's a lot of sort of backlash on that, saying that it's actually sort of counterproductive. but doesn't necessarily incentivize new supply to come on because the rents are so low, etc. So
yeah, it can work both ways. I mean, I think that the rent situation is out of control here, and the best way to address it is to significantly increase rental housing supply.
awesome. Okay, very last question. This is from Phil, and he asks, would the NDP consider banning foreign ownership or non-resident ownership in some form? And if not, how about raising the tax rates higher to fund programs?
Yeah, I think that for me the key is to stop the speculation that's happening in the market, and that's could be domestic, it could be international, and to advantage people who are living, working, and paying taxes here, being able to find a home that they can afford. And that is the priority of an NDP government. We'll look at whatever tools are necessary to achieve that goal, but I think that the ones that we've laid out are a good start to make sure that that actually happens in British Columbia.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, yeah, I mean, obviously, David, I want to thank you so much for
Thanks, Steve,
taking your time. I know that you're a busy guy these days. For those that are watching, any sort of final thoughts? Obviously, a big election coming up for you guys. Anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I know. I'm sure not all of your viewers are inclined to vote NDP, but even if you're not, I hope that you're talking to candidates in your community about the housing issue, about what you think needs to happen, so that they're educated about it. And also, I hope that you vote. And you can vote on May 9th, but you can also vote in advance polls too. So don't necessarily wait until election day. Get out there and vote. It's really, really important. Housing is, I think, the #1 issue in this election.
Absolutely, 100%. Awesome. Okay, well, yeah, thanks again, and obviously, thanks for watching.